All right, so you're ready for another deep dive, huh? We're about to unpack some really fascinating stuff, and I think you're going to love this one.
Mhm.
It's kind of like taking something you think
Yeah.
and turning it on its head, looking at it from a whole new perspective. And we're talking about how the very first followers of Jesus, those apostles, how they responded to his call to spread his message. You've probably heard it called the Great Commission.
Yeah, that's the one. And our guide for this whole thing, for this deep dive, is a book called Acts of Obedience by a guy named Stephen C. Hawthorne.
Okay, Stephen C.
Yeah.
Hawthorne.
Hawthorne, this guy, he's a pretty big deal in the world of mission work. He's the head honcho over at Waymakers, and he helped put together that massive book, Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. Oh, and he had a hand in starting up the Joshua Project, too. Plus, he co-authored a book on prayer walking, so yeah, he's been around the block a few times when it comes to this global mission stuff.
Wow, yeah, this guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. So let's jump into it, shall we? When we think about the Great Commission, that famous line in Matthew's Gospel where Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, the one. Well, sometimes it feels like, at least to me, that the apostles were a little, well, slow to get moving. I mean, they get this huge mission, right?
Yeah.
And then they just kind of hang around Jerusalem for a while. But our friend Hawthorne here, he challenges that whole idea. He wants us to really pay attention to Luke's account in the book of Acts. He's saying that the apostles were actually obedient to Jesus' commands, the way Luke tells it, at least.
Yeah, it's an interesting take.
So what we're going to try to do today is figure out what Hawthorne's argument is all about. How were those early apostles obedient? And what does that even tell us about what obedience really means? It's a deep dive for sure, folks, and it might just change how you read a pretty familiar part of the Bible.
All right, well, let's get started then.
Sounds good to me. Where do we even start?
Well, Hawthorne kicks things off by making it clear. The apostles' obedience, it all came down to them sticking with God's vision for his kingdom. They were persistent, these guys. And he points out that even before Jesus ascended, he was giving them orders, specific instructions, and get this, he was doing it by the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
That little details right there in Acts 1.2 is like, this wasn't just a one-off command. It was part of God's bigger plan, a plan that was unfolding all along.
And to really drive this whole persistence thing home, he takes us to the road to Emmaus story in Luke 24. You know that one, right?
Classic.
Two followers, probably part of Jesus' inner circle, but not one of the main 12, are walking along feeling totally defeated, scared even. Their leader was just crucified. What would you expect? And then, bing, Jesus shows up. But here's the thing. They don't recognize him at first. It's only later they figure it out. And Jesus, well, he doesn't beat around the bush. He's pretty straight with them, calls them foolish men and slow of heart to believe everything the prophets have spoken. He doesn't sugarcoat it.
Well, he never did, really. But what's really interesting here is how Jesus changes their entire understanding of what had happened. He doesn't just try to make them feel better. He actually takes them through the whole story, the whole narrative from the scriptures, and shows them how the Messiah's suffering and then his glory, those were always the main points, the central thread running through it all. And Luke tells us, straight up, that their hearts were burning within them as Jesus was explaining all this.
Yeah, they were feeling it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just some interesting Bible study either, right?
Yeah.
These two guys, they immediately turn around and walk all the way back to Jerusalem. That's 7 miles, folks. Back to the city they were probably trying to get away from in the first place, all to find the other apostles and tell them what they'd heard.
Yeah, something lit a fire under them, that's for sure.
Talk about motivated. So they get back to Jerusalem, and guess what? Jesus appears again, this time to all of them. And he goes over that same core message from the scriptures, But then he adds something really important. He tells them that the message of forgiveness, of sins being forgiven, that this message would be shouted from the rooftops to everyone, to all the nations, and it would all start right there from Jerusalem.
So that sets the stage for Jesus' instructions. During those 40 days before he ascended to heaven, he specifically tells the apostles to stay put, don't leave Jerusalem.
Okay, hold on. Doesn't that seem kind of, I don't know, counterintuitive? They're supposed to go to all nations, right? But they're stuck in Jerusalem. What's the deal with that?
That's a good point. It does seem a bit strange at first glance. But Hawthorne, he brings up something crucial that we often miss. Jerusalem, it wasn't their home. They were Galileans, remember?
Oh, right. They even had the Galilean accent, didn't they?
Exactly. And the angels even pointed out later in Acts. So Jerusalem, after everything that happened, it was probably the most dangerous place for these guys. But Jesus tells them to stay there.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. Hawthorne, He's saying that this command to stay in Jerusalem, it wasn't a delay tactic or anything. It was actually a deep act of obedience, and
Yeah.
courage, too. By staying in that hostile environment, they couldn't just run back to Galilee, back to their comfort zone. It forced them to stick together, to rely on God's promise. So it wasn't just about blindly following orders, but about God putting them exactly where they needed to be for the church to begin. Not relying on their own strength or anything familiar, but on the Holy Spirit that Jesus promised. It kind of flips the script on how we usually think about tackling a big project, doesn't it?
It does. We're always so eager to jump into action, but sometimes the most obedient thing is to stay put, to wait, to be present right where we are, even if it's hard. And we see what happens. They obey, they stay in Jerusalem, they're praying all the time together in that upper room, and then Pentecost comes. The Holy Spirit shows up, and they don't even hesitate. Bam! They're out there publicly sharing the good news.
No time wasted.
None at all. And get this. They face arrests, humiliation, threats, you name it. Some of them even get beaten up. But they don't budge. They stay visible in Jerusalem. Even after James, John's brother, is killed, the others mostly stick around. It takes a direct message from God to get Peter to leave, and even then it's just temporary. Hawthorne's point, it's really powerful. These guys, by staying in Jerusalem even when it was dangerous, they showed just how committed they were to God's vision.
So what you're saying is that sometimes obedience isn't about doing something immediately. Sometimes it's about persevering, about staying in a tough spot, because that's where you're supposed to be. It's about a bigger picture,
Yeah.
right?
Right. It's about trusting God's plan, even when it doesn't make sense to us at the time.
So we've seen how their persistence in Jerusalem was part of this obedience thing. It was about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
But what else? What's the next piece of this puzzle?
Well, next, Hawthorne focuses on their boldness, their willingness to speak up, to be public witnesses, even when it costs them something. Now, this witness thing, it's a bit different than how we usually understand it today. It's not just sharing your personal faith story with someone. It's something much bigger. Luke, the way he uses the word witness in Acts, it's more like a public declaration, often in formal settings like courtrooms or public squares.
Oh, interesting. So more like making a statement than having a quiet conversation.
Exactly. And he actually points to a pretty long list of examples in Acts, like over 20 instances where the apostles are called witnesses or are described as giving witness in public. It wasn't hush-hush stuff. It was deliberate. It was out in the open. They were shouting from the rooftops that Jesus had risen from the dead and that following him was the most important thing.
Wow, 20 times. That's a lot. They were serious about this witness thing.
Dead serious. And it wasn't just some random thing they did either. This public witness, it served a purpose, a big one. It was how the church got started,
Yeah.
And it showed people just how powerful following Jesus was just by their willingness to suffer, to keep going even when things got tough. These public trials they faced, they weren't just obstacles. They were opportunities for the early church to stand out, to be seen, recognized even. Even their opponents, the ones who were against them, even they admitted that these are people who had been with Jesus. They couldn't deny it. Their lives lived out in public, they were like a testament to their beliefs. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was an ongoing thing, a way of life, lived out for everyone to see.
That's powerful stuff. And Hawthorne, he really highlights this paradox of shame and glory. Like think about Peter and the other apostles. They actually rejoiced because they were considered worthy of being disgraced for Jesus. Or think about Paul. He was told straight up that he was chosen to carry Jesus' name before everyone. Gentiles, kings, Israelites, you name it. And that this calling would involve suffering, that he'd have to pay a price.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about talking the talk. It was about walking the walk, even when it hurt.
Yeah, that's a tough concept for us to wrap our heads around, isn't it? To actually rejoice in suffering, to see it as something good, something worthy. It's like a whole different way of looking at things, a different set of values.
It is. And so this witnessing, like Luke's talking about, it was about showing how much value there was in following Christ. And they did it through their actions, through their willingness to face the consequences of their beliefs out in the open for everyone to see. It wasn't easy.
Not at all.
And that brings us back to ourselves, What does it mean for us to stand up for what we believe, to be public witnesses, even when it might cost us something personally? Hawthorne's pushing us to think about how our lives, how we live them out in the world, how that serves as a witness to what we believe, It goes beyond just what we say. It's about how we live. So we've got their commitment to the bigger picture, their boldness in public witness. What else is there? What's the third thing Hawthorne points out about their obedience?
Well, the third thing he talks about is their faithfulness, Their dedication to helping the gospel break through, to reach new people, to spread across different cultures. And he makes it clear that even when they were focused on Jerusalem, the apostles, they were still looking for opportunities to spread the message beyond their immediate circle. They were looking for ways to expand, to reach new people.
So even while they were staying put, they were still thinking about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And we
Huh.
see this in Acts 6.4, They prioritize prayer and the ministry of the word, which basically means they were committed to spreading the gospel, to helping it grow. And they weren't just sitting around waiting for things to happen either. When they heard that the gospel was taking root in Samaria, they didn't waste any time. Peter and John were sent right away to check it out, to support that growth. And then you've got Peter going on this whole missionary journey, traveling all over Judea, Galilee, Samaria, helping all those new churches grow strong.
So they were active. They were on the move.
Oh, yeah, they were definitely on the move. And there's this really pivotal moment, it's Peter's encounter with Cornelius in Acts 10. You remember that one?
Vaguely. Remind me.
So, the Holy Spirit, he specifically tells Peter to go meet with these Gentile men, these non-Jewish guys, and to go to Cornelius's house. And Hawthorne, he points out that Peter was actually hesitant at first. He was a devout Jew, and there were all these customs, these rules about interacting with Gentiles, and he wasn't sure about it. But then, once he understood what God wanted him to do, he obeyed. And he did it quickly. He even says, that's why I came without even raising any objection when I was sent for. He owned it. And that simple act, Peter, a Jewish man, entering the house of Cornelius, a Gentile, it was huge. It was like a door opening,
Yeah, like a symbol of something bigger.
Exactly. Hawthorne says it was about more than just Cornelius and his family getting saved. It was about God opening the door of faith for all the nations to follow Jesus without having to abandon their own culture. It was a radical move that changed everything.
Wow. Talk about breaking down barriers.
Yeah, it was huge. And it leads directly to the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, a major turning point for the early church. Hawthorne, he highlights how the early church, they were grappling with this big question, do Gentile believers, do they need to adopt Jewish customs and religious practices? Like, do they have to be circumcised? And the council, guided by the apostles and the Holy Spirit, they came to a decision. Salvation, it comes through faith, and Gentiles, they don't have to become culturally Jewish to follow Christ. It's a powerful statement. And it's interesting, the main things they landed on, the things Gentiles were asked to avoid, idolatry, eating blood or strangled animals, and sexual immorality. These things, they're actually rooted in the Noahic covenant from the Old Testament, which was meant for all of humanity, not just the Jews. So it wasn't about forcing Gentiles to become Jewish. It was about upholding these universal moral guidelines.
Okay, so the council decided that faith was the key and that Gentiles didn't have to change their entire culture to follow Christ. That's a big deal.
Huge. It meant that the gospel, it wasn't limited to one group of people anymore. It was open to everyone from every background, and they could keep their own identities. And Hawthorne, he connects this to Paul's idea of the obedience of faith. It's like faith itself leads to obedience, but not necessarily to following a specific set of cultural rules.
That makes sense. So how does this whole cultural thing play out? Like, how do we make sure the gospel is understood by people from different cultures without forcing them to change who they are?
Well, Hawthorne has this really helpful way of explaining it. He talks about the wall and the canyon. So the wall, it's the barrier of communication between cultures. It's about making sure the gospel is understood clearly and in a way that makes sense to people from different backgrounds. And then there's the canyon, and that's the barrier of acceptance,
Yeah.
It's about helping people follow Christ without feeling like they have to abandon their own culture, their traditions, their whole way of life.
So it's like we want to build bridges, not walls, right? We want people to be able to connect with Christ without feeling like they have to become someone else entirely.
Exactly. And he even uses these terms, the E scale and the P scale, which are tools used in cross-cultural studies to measure the distance between cultures. The E scale is about the evangelist, the person sharing the gospel, crossing cultural barriers to reach someone. And the P scale is about how far a new believer moves away from their own culture to join a Christian community. So the idea is to minimize the distance, to build bridges, instead of making people jump across a huge canyon. He also talks about the concepts of become like and remain like, It's not about everyone becoming like some cookie-cutter Christian. It's about Christ-following communities flourishing within different cultures, reflecting those cultures in their worship and their everyday lives.
So it's not about conformity, it's about diversity, about expressing faith in a way that's authentic to who you are and where you come from.
Right. And Hawthorne, he gives some really thought-provoking examples, like imagine a Hindu who's a vegetarian. They might be afraid to become a Christian because they think they'll have to eat meat. Or a Chinese person might believe that converting to Christianity means rejecting all their ancestral traditions. Or a nomad might think that all Christians live in cities and speak English. These are just small examples, but they show how cultural assumptions can become huge obstacles for people who might otherwise be open to the gospel.
Yeah, those are really good examples. It's easy to see how our own cultural biases can unintentionally create barriers for others.
It is. And Hawthorne, his point is that Jesus didn't die to make everyone abandon their cultures, He died to offer them redemption and new life within their cultures.
That's a powerful thought. It really makes you stop and think. Like in our own lives, in our own faith communities, are we building walls for others without even realizing it? Are we making it harder for them to experience the fullness of Christ because of our own cultural baggage? Are we truly keeping the door of faith wide open for everyone, or are we expecting them to change who they are to fit in?
It's a good question, something we all need to wrestle with. So, to summarize, Hawthorne's main argument is that the apostles, they were obedient to Jesus and they showed it in three ways. Their persistence in pursuing God's vision for his kingdom, their boldness in publicly witnessing for Christ, even when it cost them something, and their faithfulness in spreading the gospel across cultures.
And what I'm hearing is that obedience, it's not always about doing something right away or doing things exactly as we think they should be done. It's about being committed to God's purpose. It's about being willing to act boldly, to be strategic, to trust that God's plan is bigger than ours, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment.
Exactly. And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. Think about the doors of faith that are open around the world today. Are we, in our efforts to share the gospel, are we accidentally building walls instead of bridges? Are we making it harder for people to follow Christ because we're clinging to our own cultural preferences? What would it look like for us to be as courageous as the apostles, to really keep those doors open for everyone, to let them experience Christ without unnecessary baggage? It's something to think about, something to wrestle with as you go on your own journey.
That's a great challenge, something to really ponder. It's about more than just words. It's about our actions, our attitudes, our willingness to let go of our own comfort and embrace the fullness of what God's doing in the world. Food for thought, for sure. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. I hope this has sparked something in you, challenged you to think a little differently about what it means to be obedient, to follow Christ, and to engage with the world around you. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep exploring, and keep seeking truth. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something fascinating, so stay tuned.
And keep those questions coming.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.